Frank Serena is a teacher and content creator who posts under the name Frank Dominic, and he joins us this morning from the Greater Toronto area. And Jennifer Leywitz is a policy analyst and content creator from Saskatchewan, and she posts under the name Jennifer L. So nice to talk to both of you this morning. I've watched some of your videos, and they are quite punchy. They're quick and really does give us an idea of perhaps what your viewers and followers are looking for. Frank, I do want to start with you. What stood out for you during this first week of campaigning?
I think a lot of people are actually surprised at just how fast the polls have changed. And I think there is a big momentum shift, and it's less about the specific policies. Part of that is because Mark Carney has kind of come out the gate, basically announcing the same things that Pierre has announced previously. And I think the Liberals are trying to frame this election to be more about the leader themselves and how that fits into the international conflicts that we're facing right now with our neighbors to the south. So at the end of the day, I really don't think this election is going to be as much about policy as it is as much about the posturing of the leaders in the parties and how people feel comfortable with them on the international stage.
What do you think, Jennifer? Because you are also a policy analyst. Are you looking out for the policies and does that influence what you're sending out to your more than 100,000 followers, for both of you more than 100,000 followers on TikTok?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, the policy stuff is what I'm looking for, and that's something sometimes people don't really recognize, that, you know, we still don't have platforms from either of the major parties that are running to lead our country. And I've been critical this week of the fact that we've been, you know, lacking tangible Indigenous policy, and people are saying, well, we're only a week into the election, but early voting has already started. And yeah, it really does feel very high level, very surface level. And we're seeing rallies, we're seeing campaign announcements across the country, but we're still missing that really tangible piece.
There are so many issues depending on where you're looking in the country. Every province has something that's important to them. But there are two really big issues in this election in particular. That's affordability and also standing up to U.S. President Donald Trump. We're hearing the word sovereignty thrown around a lot from Canadian voters. Frank, I do want to start with you. Again, looping in the videos that you're posting online and also looping in what you're hearing the major parties saying right now. How do you think they are tackling the issue of affordability? Those three main parties promising tax cuts this week. Are Canadians listening? Is this enough to really move the needle for those who are really struggling right now?
I mean, really briefly, just to put one party out of the way, I don't think people are listening to the NDP because I think the NDP has moved too far away from its roots. The NDP is supposed to be a worker party, and people who are hardcore dippers don't see that anymore. So automatically, because the party hasn't actually put forward strong policy or anything concrete, I think that people are just no longer listening. And then when we move towards the Liberals and the Conservatives, the shocking thing is that even though people would, many people would blame the Trudeau Liberals the last 4 years of unaffordability, even when you take into account COVID and everything else, people seem to be very willing to brush off the faults of the Trudeau Liberals, placing them squarely on the NDP and looking at Mark Carney as somebody who can bring in change, right? So when we look at affordability between the Conservatives and the Liberals, once again, we're seeing a lot of tax cuts. We're seeing a lot of these like kind of small things, whether it involves capital gains or this and that. But I don't personally think that that's going to change the material conditions of people's lives. And I don't think that until we see parties really look at the root causes of in our societies why people don't have money and why things are unaffordable, that we're going to actually see people truly grasp onto that policy and really claim, oh, this party is the one that truly cares about affordability. Because even right now, you see comments online, you see talking to people in person, oh, you know, they're two shades of the same color. Neither party actually cares about you. They're all for the rich, this and that. And so until either one of those parties actually takes a moment to truly consider the exact things in our lives, in our day-to-day lives that need to change, and that can happen through policy, those are big changes. Until that happens, I don't think any party is going to claim that they are truly the party of the working people.
Let's get back to that other issue, and that is U.S. President Donald Trump. Jennifer, that is a big election question for the ballot right now. Who do you think can do that, based on what you've heard so far this week?
Well, it sounds like there was a positive phone call between, you know, Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump. And I don't think that it's necessary for Canada to necessarily, you know, bend over backwards to please the United States. We are a sovereign state. We are supposed to be separate from the United States. And I think that's, you know, been one of Pierre Poilievre's downfalls over the last, you know, even month and a half, is that there hasn't been a clear and concise effort to call out President Donald Trump for the way that he's been talking about Canada. And it's okay for us to not immediately respond in a hostile way, but there is that need for Canadians to see that either of these leaders that can potentially become the next prime minister understand Canada and our sovereignty here. And it just feels like Pierre Poilievre has been almost missing the mark on that, and he's been trying to react based off of what he thinks his supporters will want to hear. And I feel like genuinely that's part of the reason why they're losing in the polls.
Getting back to social media and how Canadians are consuming news in different ways, maybe not in traditional media, but also in shorter videos like the content that you're both creating. As I mentioned, Frank, you are a teacher. Jennifer, you are a policy analyst, but you're also social media influencers with more than 100,000 followers watching your videos. But there are a lot of questions about reliability and fact-checking when it comes to social media platforms. Jennifer, what care do you take to ensure that what you're putting out there is accurate? And what do you say to those concerns?
That is actually very important for me. There's been times where I've made videos saying, there's been a video or two that I've removed because people have corrected me in the comments. And I have to be very clear about the fact that I'm not a journalist, because often the people that are watching us sometimes expect us to be, and forget that, sometimes we do have more influence than the news, depending on how many people are watching our videos and how many views it gets if it hits the algorithm in that way. But also, during the election, I received a message the other day, oddly enough, that said they had noticed that I wasn't posting as much during the election, and I haven't been. And I think that's something people were expecting more out of me during the election. But right now, when Canadians are getting ready to head to the polls, I feel the responsibility is so much stronger on what I'm putting out, and I don't want to tilt the stage or, direct my viewers to vote in a certain way. And I know that there's people that get online and that is their end goal, is to be influential and to, steer their followers in a certain way. And I kind of take the opposite approach of I've always been about self-determination. I've always been about people voting in a way that makes sense for them, especially when I have such a large Indigenous following. I need to be sure that I'm not, pushing people in one direction or another, because I might make a video that's critical of Pierre Poilievre and it gets, 10,000 views, and then I might make one that's critical of Mark Carney and it has 100,000 views. So it's this double-edged sword when you're a content creator of really making sure you're watching what you're putting out.
Frank, how about for you? Because TikTok, as both of you are very active on there, and that's where you have a lot of eyeballs, there are not only older, informed people who may be doing their research, and there are also very young people who are maybe not doing their research and really relying on the content they're consuming on social media sites. What do you do to ensure that what you're putting out there and what you're teaching the kids, even in your classroom, is driven by accuracy?
Well, one thing I'd actually push back against is young people being uninformed. There are low information voters across every age bracket. And I think that what we found with the advent of social media, as somebody who grew up, I had access to Facebook in elementary school and I had a cell phone in high school. I'm in my 30s, right? So there is a bit of a gap there between me and the current youth. But the people who properly use the tools available to them, I would argue, are more informed than the average voter in the older age bracket, simply because they've grown up in a news information environment. That being said, when we go and we post online, there are a lot of bad faith actors out there, people who will only smear one party. And listen, when it comes to Ontario, I'm a little more biased because there's a direct impact on my life. But when it came to the federal election, I've been doing everything in my power to properly criticize all the major parties and to make sure that people know, listen, regardless of the shift in the polls, even if your chosen candidate is going to win, even if you like the direction of the country, it is all of our responsibilities to constantly be criticizing those in power and to constantly be making sure that we are pushing for the things that we believe in. And for example, right now with the Conservatives struggling in the polls, I tell my followers, that is not something to be excited about if you are not a fan of Pierre Poilievre, because that means that functionally with the NDP now potentially being in the single-digit seats, if the Conservatives end up in disarray, that means that Mark Carney, if he gets a majority government, is going to have no functional opposition. That is not healthy for democracy. And so I do my best, even though my followers are a little bit more left-leaning, I do my best to try to remind them that there are important things in democracy, regardless of whether or not you believe in them or agree with them, that we all have a responsibility to be focusing on the country as a whole and to not let partisan politics get in the way of making this country the best that it has to be. And not all creators are speaking in that tone or in that light. And there are a lot of people who are essentially spreading misinformation and bashing one party or the other. And it happens on both sides.
And that is important to clarify. Thank you, Frank. It's across all age groups, whether you're informed or not informed or doing your research or not, all age groups. Thank you for highlighting that, because especially during this campaign in this day and age, as you mentioned, so many people are consuming their news on social media or getting their information that way anyway. Which campaign do you think, Jennifer, I'll start with you, has been doing a good job in reaching an audience in other ways, like through their social media platforms and trying to reach the voters that way?
Ooh, it's hard to pick between the two parties because there's obviously a conscious effort. And I'm always way more skeptical during, election periods, especially because there's like big social media influencers who kind of come out of the woodworks and, they're on the ground at the rallies. They're taking all the video footage. They're, pumping that out in real time on their social media. And I have to wonder if, these political parties also have high level conscious efforts behind the scenes on how they campaign online and through social media. But also at the same time, it's, social media is giving us real news in real time. And we're also getting it in conjunction with some of the political party candidates that are telling us their point of view on things. And a big news story this week was the Liberal candidate that was, caught allegedly saying that a Conservative candidate should be handed over to the PRC consulate in Toronto for a bounty. And then almost immediately, we're seeing a statement from MP Michael Chong on foreign interference and how that candidate should be disqualified. So Canadians are almost watching this play out step by step. And things like that do matter and they do impact campaigns. And now the light has been on the Liberal Party over the last 24 hours of what are you going to do about this? Media has picked it up and they're, all eyes are on that candidate and the Liberal Party to essentially make a decision. And social media and the reaction from people on there plays a part in how these political parties respond.
And Frank, we don't have much time, but I will give you the last word. What are your thoughts?
When it comes to that aspect, like just to go off of what Jennifer was saying, I've been seeing in my comment section when I was made the video about the Liberal MP who made those comments, or the Liberal candidate, there were a lot of people who were on the left of the political spectrum who were very critical of those comments being made. So I think that there is a mindfulness. But one thing I would say is that the Conservative Party does a much better job of enabling the more online part of their base, same with the NDP, whereas the Liberals historically tend to push away from them. And I think that just has to do with whether or not the party believes that core of their base, the online part, is going to help resonate their message beyond online, or whether they think it's a hindrance to them.
And I should mention that if you're not sure of what you're watching online, not necessarily from content creators, but just any posts out there, Elections Canada has launched a tool called Electofax that it says is supposed to help you try to understand what is the misinformation, inaccurate information out there. Also reaching out to social media sites, including TikTok, to see whether they can also play a role in ensuring what's being put out there is accurate as well. I do want to thank you so much for your time. It was a great conversation. Content creators Frank Serena and Jennifer Lewitz.